Hello, and welcome to this live podcast broadcast here from the Leeds Library as part of the Leeds LitFest 2022. I'm Molly McGrath, I'm the Projects Assistant at the Leeds Library, and I've got with me here today Gerald Dickens. Gerald is an actor, director, and producer, and the great-great-grandson of Charles Dickens. Gerald began his theatrical career in 1993 performing an energetic reading of The Christmas Carol, which has since been performed in major theatres and art centres across the world. Subsequently, he has directed and performed a plethora of acclaimed shows, including Mr. Dickens is Coming, The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby, and Great Expectations. Gerald, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to talk to you about theatre, but I guess just to give us a bit of background, how did you initially get into acting?
School nativity play, age of 9.
The classic.
Yeah, the classic. I was an insecure, shy little boy, didn't engage, didn't get on with anybody, and then all of our year were cast in a nativity play, and I was cast as a cockerel in the stable. I didn't know there was one, but apparently there was. And my father made me a costume, which was so extravagant and so big. It was unbelievable. And when I walked on stage, everyone sort of burst out laughing. And I thought, this is wonderful. What a life. People are enjoying and want to watch. So it started then. And then I got involved in every theatrical production I could through school, and then local theatre, and then semi-professional theatre, and just carried on. There's never been anything as strong in my life as full of theatre.
Clearly, creativity runs in the family.
Yeah.
It makes it interesting that you're cast as a cockerel. It makes me think of there's like a bit in the film Matilda where she's falling asleep and she's like, oh, Charles Dickens.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Roald Dahl comes back to Dickens so much in his books. I love it.
And what I like about your shows is that they're not just straight adaptations of Dickens books. Dickens did a lot of public readings, and Dr. Marigold is based off of a public reading. That's one of the shows that you're going to do tonight. And The Signalman is a ghost story. And then you have Mr. Dickens is Coming, where you play Charles Dickens himself, and that's based off his diaries. So I guess, why did you choose to go a bit left field with where you got your material for your one-man shows from? And is it important to you to leave your own stamp on the work?
Yes, definitely. The taking the last part first, definitely. It's very important for me because I'm performing using the name.
Yeah.
It's very important that an audience leave at an end of an evening thinking that was a really enjoyable show, irrespective of what my name is. So yes, I very much want to put my own stamp on it. When I began performing Dickens, I didn't want to do it. It was suggested to me that I did a reading of A Christmas Carol to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the book's publication. And up to that point, I had purposely distanced myself from having anything to do with Charles Dickens. I didn't really know an awful lot about him, to be honest. But I agreed to do the reading because it was for a charity. It was a local charity, and it was going to be a fun event. But I approached it very much as an actor with a script. I didn't see any point in trying to absolutely recreate what Dickens had done. What was the point? Nobody in the audience had seen him. Nobody knew what he sounded like. So what's the point? I just do it my own way. I used his script at that point. But other than that, I just decided to do my own way. And all of the characters, sort of as I prepared it and rehearsed it, just came to life. The first description of Ebenezer Scrooge in the book is he's a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He's hard and sharp as flint. His secret, self-contained, solitary. And by the time he gets to the end of the sentence, you become him. You can't help it.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is wonderful. I've got everything here. I've got words. He's directing me. He's producing me. He's my set finder. He's a location finder. He's everything. So I'm just going to do what feels right. So I never did a great deal of research into what he did. I just did what felt right from what I had in front of me.
Dickens, I feel, is kind of unique in its adaptability because on the one hand, it's got these kind of amazing stories which have stuck around for generations, and characters that you, like you say, you can't get out of your head. and this amazing kind of humanity and pathos and all of this, but at the same time they're long books with incredibly complex plots filled with thousands, well, not thousands, but so many different characters doing their own thing, that has obviously posed a difficulty for any adaptation, and inevitably some things are going to have to be cut out.
To drop, of course.
So I guess how do you approach what to keep in and what can be left?
It's very difficult, and my shows will tend to start at a certain length and probably end up doubling because every time I come back to them I think, oh, I've got to have that scene in, I can't leave that out. You have to have a very strong idea of what plot line you want to highlight and not allow yourself to go away from there. What you have to remember is of course, Dickens was writing in monthly installments, sometimes weekly installments. So he had to keep churning this stuff out. So a lot of it is superfluous. The characters are wonderful, and there are plenty of scenes which allow the characters to have their fun or to be villainous or full of pathos, whichever. But it might not be absolutely important to the plot. So you have to sort of take that out. Especially the early books, which tend to be much more episodic in their nature with no strong plot. It tends to have a single character going through a journey and stuff happens. So Pickwick Papers, there's no plot really. Oliver Twist, bizarrely, there's not a huge amount of plot. What there is this wonderful portrait of the low life of London. But it's not a plot. Nicholas Nickleby is not really a plot. It's just he goes places and wonderful things happen around him. So it's a question of taking the story you want to tell and sticking to that.
Yeah.
I remember my dad saying, you can always tell when Dickens was running short of material and had to fill the next item, because one character would sit back and say, now let me tell you a story. You can, okay, flip 3 pages ahead and then skip that. But when I start adapting a new show, I have a very sort of strong idea of which bits I want to feature and take it from there.
I think I've heard you say in an interview that the good thing about Dickens is that his legacy and his stories will be fine as they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing...
It doesn't matter if I'm doing this or not. I'm not preserving his legacy.
But I suppose again that is, you can be that's quite freeing, because you can be really inventive with the way the stories that you choose to tell about him, and you can come from left field a bit. And what I like again is the kind of the huge variety of the ways that you choose to tell his stories. And I think there's one where you play 30 different characters or something.
Well, that's Christmas Carol.
Yeah, that must be insane. How do you manage that?
Well, part of the work's done for me because pretty well everybody who's watching it knows the story. So actually I haven't got to worry about storytelling too much. Now, one of the pieces I'm doing tonight, Dr. Marigold, is a piece on the whole that nobody's ever heard of. So that's slightly different. I have to tell the story. I have to bring people along with me. But something like A Christmas Carol, or maybe Great Expectations, or passages from Oliver Twist, they are well known. So I'm sort of relying to a certain extent on audiences' knowledge to fill in the gaps along the way, and especially with A Christmas Carol.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about the 2 shows that you've got tonight, The Signalman and Dr. Marigold?
Yep. They're both short stories. Neither come from a novel. They're both short stories that Dickens wrote in his magazine that he published all the year round. And they were both Christmas stories. One written in 66, one written in 65. The Signalman, which is the first one tonight, is a very dark, somber ghost story. It's set on a stretch of railway line. The stranger, the narrator, sees a signalman standing down in this deep, depressing cutting by a dark tunnel, and goes down to speak with him. And the signalman sort of unburdens this terrible story he's got. And then he's haunted on the line, and a series of terrible events happen. And it's very un-Dickens. It's very dark. I mentioned earlier, it's very like a piece of Poe in its intensity. And it was written just a year after Charles Dickens was involved in a very serious rail crash. almost it was as if the rail system was tormenting him. He was terrified to ride on trains. He would often get off halfway through a journey and carry on his journey another way. In the same year, his dog was killed by a train. You know, everything seemed to be conspiring. So it's almost as if he wrote the Signalman as a way of getting it out of his mind, of exercising this experience he had. What he was suffering is now clearly identified as post-traumatic stress disorder, and is often cited in studies and books of the condition. So that's an interesting one. Marigold I love, because I think Dickens wrote it as a performance piece. I don't think he wrote it for his magazine to be published, although that's where it first appeared. He was very involved in his reading tours at that point. And Marigold is one character just talking directly to his audience, in the same way of those wonderful Alan Bennett talking heads pieces from the 1980s, where they were just a series of monologues. So he's a market trader. He's a cheapjak. And he's standing on the back of his caravan and he's talking to his crowd and he's selling, and it's fast paced and it's witty and it's funny, and he's just the nicest guy you can imagine. And then he begins to tell his story, which typically Dickens is everything. It pulls at the heartstrings. It's tragic. It's uplifting. It's beautiful. And because people tend not to know it, they're there for the ride. They come along with it. And then by the end, in Dickens's day, his tour manager said whenever Dickens did Marigold, there's a certain point at the end where you could hear sobs coming from the audience. And it still happens every time I do it. I can still hear a gasp when I say a specific line. It's a wonderful piece, and it's absolutely my favorite piece to perform, because he's such a nice man to be, Dr. Marigold. So yeah, those are the two. They're quite a difference, quite a contrast between them.
Yeah, incredibly different. I'm really excited to see the difference there. It's really interesting that Dickens has left this huge mark on the culture and on literature, that we all have seen or read some of Dickens, but because he wrote so much, there's you can never have read all of his work. Probably most people won't even ever read half of what he's written. So in that way, I think adaptations are the way that most of us come to it.
Absolutely.
Is there a right way to adapt it, and is there a wrong way?
No, I don't think so. I think pretty well the strength of the story and the characters always shines through. It's such take A Christmas Carol, which has been adapted more than anything else. You can do whatever you like with it, but the strength of that core story always comes through, whatever you do to it. I saw this week, it was announced that they're making a new adaptation of Great Expectations. They're filming it now. We're still going. And the BBC did just a wonderful version of Bleak House a few years ago. And they did it in 30-minute segments 2 or 3 times a week. So it became like a soap opera, sort of almost the way that the Dickens wrote it, very fast paced and people desperate for the next episode. Sometimes people become too reverent, I think, about it, and then too perfect. And I think Dickens was such a flamboyant, theatrical man. And that's what I try and get across in all of my shows, is how theatrical Dickens was. Yes, he was a master of literature, but his passion was theatre, and that just screams through. I think to take what he gave us and then make it theatrical is the biggest tribute you can give.
It's interesting that you say that, because actually, it's so true that we have this kind of idea of Dickens as this kind of benevolent kind of grandfather of writing in a way. He's kind of national hero, but I'm interested that you're kind of drawn to this kind of more vulnerable side to him. And I know that you've written a book about this kind of experience that he had on the railway.
The rail crash, just published at the end of last year. Dickens and Staplehurst, a biography of a rail crash, available from all good Dickens websites. And it was very interesting. It was a very difficult time in his life. There was a lot going on for him. And then suddenly he was thrust into the middle of this terrible, terrible disaster.
Is it
that profoundly affected him.
Is it important for you to kind of see that side of him as well as, you know, this not a caricature, but this kind of...
Yes, because it makes him more real. It makes him a real person. And when I did that very first reading of A Christmas Carol, as I said, I wasn't really keen on doing it. At that time, my mind was full of Dickens, the benevolent, grandfatherly author who sat on the back of postage stamps or £10 banknotes. But what I discovered was this theatricality, and therefore this frailty and this insecurity, which all actors have. And that made him much more fascinating to me, much more fascinating as a person.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of alluded to it a bit, but how has your relationship to Dickens changed over your lifetime?
Hugely. I've become much closer. I feel like, not that I know him, but I feel like I understand a lot. And then you come back to the literature, and all these theatrical influences are there. You can see them. You know, so when I studied Oliver Twist at school, aged 14, and hated every second of it, now I can see the man in the words, and that's fascinating.
And in terms of reception, I know that you've done a lot of work in America where Dickens is hugely popular. And I mean, he himself went there and did readings. How do you find the reception changes over there as opposed to here in the UK?
Love Dickens. I travel there normally at Christmas, so I'm doing A Christmas Carol almost exclusively. And America has sort of adopted A Christmas Carol as a central part of the Christmas celebrations there. So in any town you visit, there will be productions of Christmas Carol in the big theatres. Schools will be doing it. There'll be radio versions of it on local radio networks. It's sort of like pantomime in here. It's the big Christmas money spinner to allow theatres to do what they like the rest of the year. It's massive. And all the TV shows have their own special spins on it and all sorts of things. So people love A Christmas Carol. Even if they have no idea that Charles Dickens wrote anything else, they know A Christmas Carol and love it and identify with it. And also I think Dickens's life story, Poor Boy Made Good, is a very American thing. It's the American dream. You know, if you just work and work and work and follow a dream and keep bullying everybody out of the way, you're going to be successful. And that's what he did. And America takes to that as well. They identify with that.
I think it's interesting what you were saying about Dickens originally kind of writing in periodicals and you know, the novels weren't all published at the same time, and there was these kind of, you know, these quite grand stories, often on quite epic scales. And actually that quite, I mean, I think I maybe it's tenuous, but see a link to these kind of huge TV sagas.
It's very similar, very similar.
Which are very American.
And what that did, that way of writing, allowed a much larger readership, because the monthly parts, they weren't bound in beautiful leather bindings like we're surrounded in here. They were just paper, the paperbacks in effect, and sold very cheaply. So suddenly literature was available to a much wider part of society. And you're right, those long TV dramas, what's going to happen next week? We're left on a cliffhanger. We've got to get the next part. You know, people are talking about it.
Have you, I mean, do you often visit the places that Dickens would do as kind of public readings?
I have done, and then performed in a few of them, which is amazing. Very exciting to do that, to stand on the same stage and say the same words is quite astounding.
You were talking about visiting a library in New York and seeing a manuscript.
Yeah, the J.P. Morgan Library in New York City is where the original handwritten manuscript of A Christmas Carol is held. What it's doing there, I have not the faintest idea, but anyway, it is. And a few years ago, I was allowed to go and look at it, and I assumed I'd be put in gloves and all sorts, but no, they just put it on the table and said, spend as long as you like with it.
Yeah.
So I was there holding the actual pages, the paper that Dickens had touched, and seeing where the ink had splashed and where the nib had scratched the paper, and just
was it easy to read, the handwriting?
It's impossible. I have a theory. Dickens actually didn't write any of his books. I think his publisher wrote them all. So he said, can't read that, I'll make it.
Yeah, well, listen, as someone with terrible handwriting,
ditto. But part of that is because he wrote so rapidly. The ideas, and especially with A Christmas Carol, which he wrote incredibly quickly, the ideas just flashed into his mind, and you know, there are notes up in the margins and little writings between lines where he had another idea or wanted to put something else in. yeah, you can see the energy.
Yeah.
And that's what comes through with every aspect of Dickens, energy. That's
yeah. And I suppose that's why it translates so well into theatre.
I think so.
Yeah, you have that kind of energetic
I think you're right.
aspect of it. I wonder, I mean, you said that Dr. Marigold is your favourite show to perform, but I wonder if you have a favourite Dickens novel. It's probably a difficult question.
It is an impossible question. Again, my father, when I started doing this, he said, you'll always be asked that question. And the best answer is to throw it back and say, well, what's your favorite? But no, I think probably Great Expectations.
Okay.
I think it's an astounding novel. It's one of his very last ones. So it was very carefully planned. Those early ones, as I said, were just very episodic and I've got to get stuff out. The later ones were much more carefully planned and structured. And Great Expectations with the characters of Miss Havisham and Stella and Wemmick, God bless him, and then the aged P and Mr. James. They're just it's a wonderful cast of characters. It's an extraordinary book.
And actually, what I notice about adaptations of that, and actually adaptations of Dickens' work in general, is that they tend to take on the kind of ideas and themes and topics that are zeitgeisty of a culture at any given time. So, you know, contemporary ones, we talk about contemporary issues, ones that are made in the 50s, they'll kind of reflect those ideas of the time. And I suppose it's because those characters are really universal and have stood the test of time.
And the themes he's writing about are just as relevant today as they were when you wrote, and that's a very sad thing, but a huge poverty gap between the richest and the poorest is more of a problem maybe than it was in his time, and that's a very sad thing. But you know, we keep coming back to it, to be taught, to be told, to be shown that these problems exist.
So I guess my final question is that I know Dickens did visit Leeds and he didn't think very much of it.
I'm sorry. Well, not quite true. Other than using the word odious. Well, but on that first visit, he was suffering from a terrible cold. It was the middle of December. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't understand the train system and was here to make a speech and didn't feel like making a speech. But he did keep coming back. He came back 5 times, and especially on his reading tours. And in fact, he performed Dr. Marigold in Leeds in 1865, I think, or 67, something like that. So he performed Marigold here. So he kept coming back. It was a regular stop on his tours. So, you know, it wasn't all bad.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it wasn't all bad.
That's good to know.
And actually, I think the very first reading he did, he wrote home saying it was a wonderful hall and a wonderful feeling, but the newspapers didn't like it.
Okay. Well, that can cloud anyone's
he kept having problems with the newspapers, but no, he did keep coming back. So we'll skip over the O word and.
Yes. Well, I hope that. I mean, I'm glad that he had a better time than I initially thought, but I hope that you have had a better impression of Leeds.
It's wonderful. It's great to be here and in such an amazing surroundings as this.
Yeah. So, if people are interested, you have a website, don't you? And that is
GeraldDickens.com.
GeraldDickens.com.
Gerald Dickens, all one word. Yeah.
If you're interested in finding out more about the LitFest, the other events in our programme, that's www.leedslitfest.co.uk. Gerald, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Super excited to watch your show.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.